In this lesson, we're going to solve by factoring polynomials completely. So here's a list of things that we can do to make sure that we factor a polynomial completely. The first thing is we'll want to factor out any common terms. We're then going to look for any special patterns. We'll factor a trinomial. Those have got the 3 terms. Remember to do that. We will be making the 2 sets of parentheses. We will factor by grouping. We do that when we factor, or when we have 4 terms. And then we check for any other factoring that we might be able to do. All right, so solve the equation by factoring completely. All right, so let's go through our checklist. First of all, we're going to factor out any common terms. So looking at c to the third plus 7c squared plus 12c, I can see that I can factor out a c. So I'm going to have c times, and then I'll have c squared plus 7c plus 12, and that's going to be equal to 0. All right. Now let's look for any special patterns, and I don't see any special patterns. Our next thing then, let's factor if it's a trinomial. Remember, a trinomial has 3 terms in it, and so this has 3 terms. And remember, we factor trinomials by making 2 sets of parentheses. So I'm going to have my c, and then I'm going to have those 2 sets of parentheses. All right, so c. And now we're looking for then our factors of 12. All right, so factors of 12, we could have 1 times 12, I can have 2 times 6, and then I can have 3 times 4. All right, and also remember, we're looking to make up the middle term is a 7c. So do any of these make up a 7? And I can see that 3 plus 4 would make that up. So let's start with that. All right, now we just want to double check. I have 3c and a 4c, so my inside and my outside. And is that going to equal that 7c? And it does. All right, so these are going to both be pluses. All right, so now we're ready to solve because it's factored completely. So I'm going to have a c is equal to 0, and I'll have a c plus 3 is equal to 0, so c will be equal to -3. And then I have a c plus 4 is equal to 0, so c would also be equal to -4. And all of these then are solutions to that equation. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at our next one. We have 4x to the third minus 44x squared plus 96x is equal to 0. All right, so let's go ahead and factor out, first of all, any common terms. And it looks like here I can factor out a 4 and I can factor out an x. So let's do that then first. So I have my 4x times an x squared minus then -44, I'd have 11, and then the x plus 4 goes into 96 24 times, and now this is equal to 0. So we've done that, and I don't see any special patterns. And so now let's look. I do have then a trinomial. So we're going to go factor, or make this into 2 sets of parentheses. So I've got my 4x, and then I'm going to have my x and my x. All right, so now we're looking for our factors of 24. And so the factors of 24 are what? 1 times 24, 2 times 12, 3 times 8, and 6 times 4. All right, now again, we're looking for this -11x here. So I would want to pick and find a factor, factors that are going to make up that -11. So let's take a look right here. I have a 3 and an 8, don't I? So let's plug that in. I've got a 3 and I have an 8. And also then remember or notice that we have a -11 there. So I know that 2 negatives make a positive. And then, so going this way, that's going to make up that positive 24. But then now looking at, I have a 3x, and then I'm going to have a -8x, and that's going to make up that middle term there. All right, so now that I have it factored, let's go ahead and let's solve. I'm going to have a 4x is equal to 0. So I'd have 4x is equal to 0. So I know x is going to be equal to 0. And then I have my x minus 3 is equal to 0. So I know x is going to be equal to 3. And then I have my x minus 8 is equal to 0. And I have then x is equal to 8. All right, question number 3. I have 50h to the 4th minus 2h squared. So let's start by factoring out any common terms. So it looks like I can have a 2 and a h squared I can factor out. So I'm going to start there by taking 2h squared. Well, then I'm going to have 25h squared, and then minus negative 2h squared divided by positive 2h squared just is negative 1. All right, so now notice this right here, that I can take the square root of a 25 and I can take a square root of a 1. And so those are those special ones where then those common terms end up canceling out. So I'm not quite done. Here, this should have been set to 0 or equal to 0. All right, so I'm going to have my 2h squared, and then so I know that I have 5h and a 5h to make up that 5h squared, and then the square root of 1 is 1. And remember that we were able to cancel out those middle terms by having 1 be a plus and 1 be a minus. All right, so I have 2h is equal to 0, so h is equal to 0. And I have a 5h plus 1 is equal to 0. And when I solve, I'd minus the 1 and divide by 5. So I have negative 1/5. And then I've got the 5h minus 1 is equal to 0. And so then I'm going to plus that 1 here, and h is going to be equal to positive 1 all over 5. And so these then are the solutions to this equation. All right, so let's take a look at the fourth one. I have w squared times w squared minus 9 minus 81 times w squared minus 9 is equal to 0. So let's take a look here, and first of all, factor out any common terms. I don't see any yet. Look for any special patterns. I don't see those. It's not a trinomial. Now look at this. It doesn't have the 4 terms, but notice this grouping part. Remember, so what I can factor out here first, notice how I have those 2 binomials. I'm going to start by factoring those out first. And so what I'm going to have then is I'm going to have w squared minus 9. And then I've got this w squared minus 81. So w squared minus 81. All right, so then it says check for any other factoring. So I'm going to go back up through my list and just kind of look there. So now, do I have any common terms? No, I don't have any of those. But do I have any special patterns? And notice that I have the w squared minus 9 and the w squared minus 81. And those two can be factored further by having, I've got the w and the w. And remember that those middle terms had canceled out, because what I have then is a 3 and a 3, and one was a positive and one was a negative. And then I have the same thing here for this w squared minus 81. And so I'm going to have a w and a w, and again I'm going to have a positive 9 and a negative 9, and then all this is equal to 0. So w plus 3 is equal to 0, so w is going to be equal to negative 3. And then w minus 3 is equal to 0, so w is going to be equal to positive 3. And then w minus 9, so w is equal to 9, and w is equal to, whoops, this should have been a plus, negative 9. All right, so there are all of our solutions to this one. All right, so now I have 3x to the third plus 18x squared minus 24x. All right, first of all, let's make everything equal to 0. So to do that, remember, I'd have to add this 24x on both sides. So I'll have 3x to the third plus 18x squared plus 24x is equal to 0. All right, so now let's take, and can we factor out any common terms. So I'm looking to see what I could factor out. I know I can factor out that x, but I can also factor out a 3 because 3 goes into all of those. So I have a 3x and I have an x squared plus 6x plus then just 8, and that's equal to 0. So 3x, now look for any special patterns. I don't see any there, but I do have a trinomial here. So let's go ahead and we're going to make that into 2 sets of brackets or parentheses. All right, so this x squared is made with an x. And then I have to look at my factors of 8. So I've got, let's see here, 1 times 8, and I have 2 times 4. Well, since I'm wanting to make this 6x in the middle, let's try the 2 and the 4. So I have 2 and I have a 4, and everything's positive there, so I know I'd have x here, and then here I'd have a 4x. I just want to make sure that that made that 6x. All right. So these are both pluses. Okay, so now I've got my 3x is equal to 0. So x is equal to 0. I have my x plus 2 is equal to 0, so x is equal to negative 2. And then I have my x plus 4 is equal to 0, so my x is equal to negative 4. All right, so we have one more example here. Let's go ahead and start by factoring out any common terms. So let's see, I'm going to take, what could come out? I've got probably a negative 5 and an x. So I'm going to take out my negative 5 and an x. And that's going to leave me with an x squared, a positive x squared. Now negative 5x goes into 30x squared, negative 6x times. And then negative 5x goes into negative 40x, positive 8 times. All right, then it's equal to 0. All right, so now we have negative 5x, and then I don't have any special patterns, but I do have a trinomial here. So let's go ahead and put 2 sets of parentheses here. And I'm going to have my x's, and then I can see it like 2 times 4. Now, we have to be careful here, though, because we've got a negative 6x. So I have a 2x and a 4x, and now, remember, we want them to be positive. So negative 2 times negative 4 makes that 8x. And then let's check to see then, does the negative 2x and then negative 4x, does that then make our middle terms there, or that middle term? Yes, it does. So now we're ready to then just continue to solve. And we're going to have negative 5x is equal to 0, so x is equal to 0. We have the x minus 2 is equal to 0, so x is equal to positive 2. And then x minus 4 is equal to 0, so then we have an x is equal to 4. All right, so in this lesson, we took a look at how to solve equations by factoring completely.